The pre-dawn air hung thick with the smell of diesel and salt as the horizon shifted from black to a muted blue-gray. It was the morning of late June, in the year 1944, somewhere east of the Mariana Islands, when Lieutenant Commander Haruo Fujita stepped onto the narrow catwalk along the port side of the carrier Zuikaku. At this hour, the sea usually felt indifferent, a blank, rolling emptiness. But this morning it carried a pressure he could not quite name. The night before, intelligence had reported a cluster of American fast carriers still operating somewhere beyond the radar horizon. Their precise movements were uncertain, but one detail had come through repeated intercepts and prisoner interrogations. One American carrier, it was said, could launch 80 to 90 aircraft in under an hour. He did not believe it. Not fully. Not yet. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. He had been raised in a navy built on the certainty that quality triumphed over quantity, that the sword of superior training could cut through any industrial shield the Americans could forge. The Pearl Harbor strike had reinforced this belief. The attack on Darwin, the early months of sweeping advances across the Pacific, all of it pointed toward a worldview that felt immutable. Japanese naval aviation had been crafted through decades of selective admissions, elite training regimens, relentless flying hours, and operational philosophies built around precision. A single carrier was not a factory of airplanes. It was a temple to the craft of naval aviation, its rhythm defined by discipline, not mass. But the war of that morning did not resemble the war he had trained for. The Zuikaku's early risers moved with quiet efficiency around him, preparing aircraft for the day's reconnaissance sweep. Oil-smeared mechanics checked the fuel lines of the Aichi dive bombers. Armorers carried small wooden crates of bombs and shells. The ship's own production capacity on that morning was predictable, almost ritualistic. A full strike package took time. Launch sequence required careful spacing. Pilots needed briefing. Engines needed warming, flight crews needed coordinated choreography. It all made sense. And that was exactly why the intelligence reports did not. Fujita paused beside the portside railing and peered out over the water, where a faint line of cloud marked the far horizon. Somewhere out there, perhaps just beyond the curve of the Earth, American pilots were climbing into cockpits. Somewhere out there, a ship was preparing not a dozen, not several dozen, but near 100 aircraft for launch in what sounded like impossible speed. He wondered what a flight deck must look like when moving that fast. What sort of machinery, what sort of planning, what sort of physical space could make such a claim plausible? He wondered, without quite admitting it to himself, whether the war had already passed beyond the reach of Japanese doctrine. He exhaled slowly. The war had been shifting under his feet since the year 1942, when the Imperial Navy lost 4 irreplaceable carriers at Midway. Japanese naval aviation had never fully recovered from that blow, but men like Fujita continued to believe that discipline, experience, and spirit could compensate for structural disadvantages. Yet, by the year 1944, rumors of American production capability had swollen into something approaching myth. Stories circulated of new American carriers entering service every 1 to 2 months, of pilot training pipelines that seemed almost mechanical in consistency, of shipyards that never slept. But the claim that a single American carrier could launch close to 100 aircraft in less than an hour, this still felt like an exaggeration born from fear. It defied everything Fujita understood about carrier flight operations. He had spent his life inside the Imperial Navy's aviation program. He knew how long it took to prepare a Zero fighter for launch. He knew the time required to spread wings, run engines, secure the flight deck, and sequence aircraft into the wind. He knew that one misalignment, one stumble, one mistake could delay an entire strike. Quality required time. Quantity required obedience to process. But both required limits. The first whisper of an internal challenge stirred in him. What if American carriers operated differently, not merely in scale, but in philosophy? Below him, a plane captain primed the fuel mixture of a Nakajima fighter. The engine coughed to life. Others followed, until the rising mechanical drone formed a vibrating chorus that made the deck plates tremble. The familiar noise grounded him again in what he knew. This was how naval aviation worked. This was the rhythm of war. Aircraft could not be willed into the sky faster than human hands and engines allowed. And yet, the intelligence report had been explicit. A captured American pilot from the Essex-class Yorktown had claimed that during intensive operations, each ship could launch a full air group, 60 to 90 aircraft, in 45 to 50 minutes, under optimal conditions. The pilot, a lieutenant junior grade named William Hutchins, had spoken with a kind of casual certainty, as if describing a morning routine rather than a military feat. The statement had been dismissed at first as exaggeration, but subsequent reports from signals intercepts and submarine observations had reinforced the same conclusion. Carrier-based American aircraft arrived in numbers and timing that suggested a tempo of operations the Japanese had not previously believed possible. Fujita touched the cold metal railing, grounding himself in the present. The sun was beginning to rise, throwing a pale shaft of light across the flight deck. Men were moving with a quiet purpose, unaware of the shift in naval warfare taking place far beyond their sight. These men believed, as he had believed, that the strengths of the Japanese Navy remained intact, that skill could match industry, that experience could match numbers, that the flight deck beneath their boots represented a balanced contest between equals. But Fujita's unease grew as the hum of engines deepened. Something in the American system had changed. Something large, something structural, something that threatened to reduce everything the Imperial Navy had built into a series of increasingly desperate defensive actions. He knew the American Essex-class carriers existed. He had read the specifications, but reading numbers was different from imagining what those numbers meant in practice. Another intelligence estimate had placed their standard air group at 3 dozen Hellcat fighters, 3 dozen dive bombers, and nearly 2 dozen torpedo bombers. More than enough to sustain relentless operations. What he did not yet fully grasp was how quickly those aircraft could be mobilized when required. In the distance, somewhere far over the horizon, the truth was already forming. It would arrive not through theory, nor through intercepted signals, but through a sound, the droning buildup of multiple American squadrons rising into the sky. A sound that would carry across miles of open ocean and deliver a realization not through words, but through the unmistakable physical weight of mass. That moment had not come yet, but it was moving closer. The truth was this: Japanese flight decks could surge perhaps 15 to 20 aircraft in their first launch wave under perfect conditions. American decks, by mid-war, could surge multiples of that number in a single coordinated effort. But Fujita did not yet have the evidence to internalize such a fact. He would need to see it, to hear it, to live inside the moment, when the volume of aircraft exceeded the capacity of belief. In those pre-dawn hours of late June, however, he still held on to the world he understood. For now, to understand the weight of the intelligence report that haunted him, one must understand the world that shaped his certainty. The Imperial Japanese Navy had spent the 2 decades before the war cultivating an aviation corps built on selective rigor. Pilots were chosen through unforgiving examinations and trained through flight hours measured not by fuel consumption, but by exhaustion. The doctrine emphasized precision attacks, coordinated squadron maneuvers, and aggressive tactics that demanded elite skill. Their early successes were not accidental. By the time the Pacific War began, Japanese carrier pilots averaged far more flight experience than their American counterparts. Flight operations aboard Japanese carriers had long been defined by meticulous choreography. Each pilot and deck crewman had a precise role. Aircraft had to be positioned carefully, wings spread only when there was physical space and strategic timing. Ordnance was loaded manually with checks repeated often. Fueling procedures required time. Engines needed proper warm-ups to prevent catastrophic failures mid-air. Launch sequences required exact intervals to avoid airflow turbulence that could flip or stall a rising aircraft. All of this meant that Japanese carrier strikes were deliberate affairs, sharp in execution, but limited in pace. This system had been sufficient when Japan sought quality over quantity, when its enemy appeared unprepared, when trained pilots outmatched American aviators, still learning the demands of naval air warfare. But by the year 1943, American aviation training had grown more robust. By the year 1944, American naval aviation had become something else entirely, not just skilled, but abundant. Not just abundant, but synchronized with a logistical system so vast that Japanese planners could scarcely imagine its scope. To men like Fujita, trained in the doctrine of scarcity of fuel, of pilots, of aircraft, of replacement parts, the idea of abundance felt almost alien. The Imperial Navy had always assumed that a carrier's chief limitation was its aviation personnel and aircraft. But American carriers had pilots waiting behind pilots, planes waiting behind planes, and a training pipeline capable of replacing losses at rates Japan could not approach. Still, none of that fully explained the speed of American launch operations. Someone had changed something fundamental in their flight deck process. Someone had redesigned the rhythm of naval aviation. And although the Japanese Navy knew the Essex-class carriers were standardized in design, they did not yet grasp how standardization itself multiplied operational efficiency. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So, if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. For years, Japanese carriers had individuality. Deck layouts varied between classes, maintenance routines differed, equipment placement changed ship to ship, but the Essex class was built through mass production, where each ship mirrored the next. Pilots could transition carriers without relearning deck geometry. Deck crews could operate with interchangeable parts. Process replaced improvisation. Standardization replaced artisanal skill. This was the foundation of the intelligence claim that troubled Fujita. But knowledge on paper does not translate to belief. Belief often requires impact. Belief often requires sound. Belief often requires seeing a sky filled beyond expectation. The Imperial Navy still thought in terms of what was reasonable based on its own systems. But the Americans were no longer operating on reasonable. They were operating on industrial reality. It would be hours before the Zuikaku scouts returned, if they returned at all. Hours before the Japanese carrier group learned just how close American Task Force 58 had maneuvered. Hours before the noise of American carrier aviation would cross the threshold from rumor to memory. But that moment would come. And when it did, it would not simply change Fujita's understanding of American carriers. It would change his understanding of war itself. All of this contrasted with the broader landscape of the war in late June of 1944. The Marianas campaign had escalated into a confrontation that neither side could avoid. The Japanese had committed nearly every remaining carrier asset in what they hoped would be a decisive engagement, a last chance to halt American advances before the Marianas fell and place the Japanese homeland within striking distance of American long-range bombers. Yet, even before the fighting fully developed, Japanese staff officers understood their training pipeline lagged dangerously behind American output. Their pilots, many with under 100 hours of total flight time, faced American aviators with 500 to 1,000 hours. But even this disparity did not capture the full extent of the problem. The Americans had not only improved training, they had industrialized the very process of learning to fly. The conversion of Great Lakes vessels into training carriers, Wolverine and Sable, had allowed American pilots to practice carrier landings repeatedly without risk of enemy action. It meant that hundreds of new pilots each month gained the skill necessary to operate from a carrier deck under wartime conditions. Meanwhile, the Japanese Navy struggled with spiraling losses in both pilots and instructors. Each pilot lost represented not just one combatant, but years of irreplaceable experience. Industrial capacity, however, explained only part of what Fujita was about to witness. The speed of launch operations aboard the Essex-class ships resulted from a combination of design choices: expansive flight decks, powerful elevators, robust deck-edge lifts, advanced arresting gear, and deck crews trained in a procedural system emphasizing continuous operations rather than staged operations. Unlike Japanese carriers, where aircraft were often prepared below deck and then moved up in carefully timed batches, American carriers embraced the use of deck parks, large groups of ready aircraft spotted directly on the flight deck. This allowed immediate launch with minimal repositioning. It allowed waves of fighters to rise rapidly in response to threats. It allowed dive bombers and torpedo bombers to take off in coordinated sequence without lengthy preparation below decks. None of this had been fully absorbed by Japanese intelligence analysts. They knew the numbers. They did not yet understand the speed. And speed in the deeply mathematical world of carrier warfare can be as decisive as firepower itself. The Imperial Navy's doctrine had long rested on the assumption that carriers were finite instruments of power projection. Each strike consumed irreplaceable pilots and aircraft. Each launch required delicate preparation. Each landing carried risk. The system was built to preserve strength. American doctrine, by 1944, had reversed this logic. Strength existed to be used, and their production system ensured it could be replenished faster than it could be expended. This philosophical shift translated directly into operational speed. Fujita did not know any of this with certainty, but he sensed something shifting. The confidence that had carried him through the early war years no longer aligned with the realities he observed. He had seen too many young, undertrained pilots fail to return from missions. He had watched too many aircraft disappear into the ocean because spare parts were scarce. He had watched the once proud Japanese carrier fleet shrink into a fragile instrument held together by dwindling resources and exhausted men. By contrast, the Americans seemed to grow stronger after each major battle. It felt unnatural. It felt unfair. It felt as though the war itself had chosen a side. He leaned over the railing and closed his eyes as the engines behind him roared louder. The first scout plane was preparing for launch. Deck crews signaled with paddles. The propeller wash sent a blast of warm, oily air across his face. The scene was familiar, practiced, and comforting in its precision. But it was also slow. He knew it. He felt it. The scout plane taxied forward, wings outstretched, engines screaming at full power. Minutes passed. Men moved carefully. Checks were performed. The launch officer waited for the ship to turn into the wind. How long did it take? 5 minutes? 7? Long enough for Fujita to recall the American lieutenant's words, 90 aircraft in under an hour. Impossible. And yet, somewhere over the horizon, the truth was forming. The Japanese planners returned to their tables with renewed urgency. What they had learned from this unexpected American capability gnawed at them. Everything, every war game, every staff memo, every fleet readiness schedule, had been built on the assumption that the United States Navy would fight the way navies traditionally fought, in deliberate steps, with predictable rhythms, with numbers that reflected the known size of air groups. A carrier flight operation was supposed to look like a ritual, something almost liturgical in its pacing. But the Essex had shown that the Americans were no longer operating on the same rules. If a single American carrier could generate that much offensive power that quickly, then the math that defined Japanese naval strategy was disintegrating beneath their feet. And yet, among the officers of the combined fleet, there was an odd reluctance to say it out loud. It was as if acknowledging the implications would make them real, would force them to confront the widening gap between their doctrine and the world that was now forming against them. The Imperial Navy had prided itself on elite aviators, on meticulous training, on the elegance of the Kido Butai's choreography. But none of that mattered if the enemy could simply overwhelm them with speed and quantity. Worse still, it wasn't only speed and quantity, it was that American flexibility. Those chaotic knots of activity the shadowing pilot had seen, which looked like disorder, but somehow produced results far greater than the sum of their parts. When word reached Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, he found himself conflicted. He was a student of naval history. He had always believed that the carrier age demanded boldness, demanded the ability to seize the initiative before one's opponent understood what was happening. But boldness without strength was suicide. And what he now saw was that the United States was accelerating its strength at a pace the Imperial Navy could not match. The Japanese could design elegant machines, but the Americans could build them by the dozens. The Japanese could train superb pilots, but each loss was irreplaceable. The Americans, with their enormous training pipeline, were filling decks and classrooms at a rate that defied belief. A few days after the shadowing incident, another report filtered into Combined Fleet Headquarters, a radio intercept from U.S. fleet chatter that mentioned almost casually that the Essex-class program had surpassed its midpoint. Several more carriers were completing sea trials, others were launching, others were still on slipways but would soon float free and take their place beside their sisters. The phrase production line carriers appeared in one of the decoded messages, and it struck Japanese analysts like a blow. A production line was something that produced automobiles or washing machines. To apply such a term to warships suggested an industrial capacity that dwarfed anything the Imperial Navy had ever imagined. American naval aviation was not merely strong, it was multiplying. In Tokyo, at the Navy Ministry, a few senior officers privately admitted that they had underestimated the Americans' ability to convert industry into military output. They had assumed, based on pre-war intelligence, that the Essex-class construction schedule would allow the Americans to field perhaps a handful of units at a time. Instead, the pace had accelerated, not a handful, but a flood. And each of those platforms, as now confirmed, could function like a small air force in its own right. The Japanese pilot, who had observed the Essex from afar, was interviewed multiple times, not because his report contradicted anything, but because it seemed impossible. "Look again," one skeptical commander said, flipping through the photographs. "Are you certain these aircraft all belong to the same ship?" The pilot nodded, frustration mixing with resignation. He understood why they doubted him. The sight had been unbelievable even to him. But the Americans had believed it. They had designed for it. They had trained for it. A few Japanese analysts identified the key factor: deck-edge elevators. The American carriers were equipped to move aircraft directly between the hangar and the flight deck without blocking the deck during critical phases of the launch sequence. That single design choice, born from Andean quantities of steel and a willingness to innovate, was allowing the Essex to keep aircraft flowing upward like a continuous current. Japanese carriers, by contrast, still relied mostly on centerline elevators, which required flight ops to pause or adjust every time a plane needed to be lifted. The difference in tempo compounded. What seemed like a minor design preference in peacetime had become a strategic advantage in war. This revelation stung deeply. For years, Japan had assumed that its naval aviators could compensate for any industrial disparity. Skill would triumph over quantity. Precision would beat brute force. But now that equation was reversing itself. American carriers could launch faster, recover faster, repair faster, refuel faster, rearm faster. And speed in carrier warfare was a multiplier. The faster one could strike, the sooner one could strike again. And the sooner one could strike again, the more likely one was to keep the enemy off balance. Something else became apparent. This new Essex capability was not just an isolated flourish of efficiency. It was part of a systemic evolution underway in the U.S. Navy. The Americans were optimizing not just ships, not just air groups, but entire operational concepts. Their task groups were reconfiguring themselves around the principle of massed air power. They were no longer thinking in terms of individual carriers, but in terms of multi-carrier task forces capable of generating waves of aircraft that could saturate Japanese defenses. The Essex pilot tempo was only one aspect of a broader transformation in how Americans were fighting the naval air war. And deep in the recesses of Japanese planning rooms, the specter of Midway returned. That battle, once seen by the Japanese as a moment of improbable misfortune, now looked more like the beginning of a trend. The Americans learning, adapting, accelerating. They had drawn lessons from disaster. They had built better carrier decks, better damage control systems, better aircraft, better training programs. They had understood that naval aviation was an industrial contest as much as a tactical one. Every lesson the Americans learned had been reinforced with steel, with factories, with manpower. Japan could not match that. Still, there were those who argued that quality might yet win the day. Japanese aircraft like the Shiden and the Hayate were in development. Experienced pilots remained, though fewer each month. The Yamato and Musashi still loomed as symbols of naval supremacy. And if the Imperial Navy could lure the Americans into a decisive engagement under favorable conditions, perhaps their numerical disadvantage could be mitigated. But even this hope was tarnished by the Essex reports. If one of those carriers could generate as many sorties in a single launch cycle as several Japanese carriers combined, then what might happen when the Americans committed multiple Essexes simultaneously? What if the Americans arrived at the decisive battle with not 3 carriers, not 4, but 6 or 7 or more, each capable of launching nearly 100 aircraft in a tight sequence? A clash that Japan had once envisioned as a balanced contest was now beginning to look like an avalanche waiting to fall. Rumors circulated, never officially confirmed but whispered, that the Americans were experimenting with deck-load strikes, where every available aircraft, regardless of type, was loaded onto the deck in a single massive wave. To the Japanese, whose doctrine emphasized carefully layered strike packages and strictly sequenced attacks, this sounded reckless. But reckless methods sometimes produced results, especially if one had enough aircraft to risk such things. The Americans, with their unprecedented output, did. In wargames held at Combined Fleet headquarters, staff officers tried to simulate an engagement with a task group centered around multiple Essex carriers. The results were grim. Japanese strike groups, once prized for their precision, were being intercepted before they could even reach the American formation. American combat air patrols, bolstered by higher sortie rates, were arriving in overwhelming numbers, and any Japanese carriers that sought to launch or recover aircraft under such assault were quickly suppressed by counterstrikes that arrived faster than expected. Even Admiral Toyoda, who considered himself an optimist, privately acknowledged that the Imperial Navy was facing a threat greater than the one it had feared before Midway. "This is no longer the same enemy," he said quietly to a small circle of staff officers, "and we are no longer the same force." The sense of diminishing horizons grew with each passing month. The Americans were not merely replacing their losses, they were growing stronger with every battle. Meanwhile, the Japanese pilot corps, once the finest in the world, was being eroded by attrition. Training hours were cut, fuel shortages meant fewer exercises. Replacement pilots were being rushed to the front with barely half the experience of their predecessors. The Americans, by contrast, were training pilots in vast numbers at purpose-built facilities with no shortage of fuel, aircraft, or instructors. Within this context, the new American launch capability was not just impressive, it was a harbinger. It suggested that the Americans' could generate sustainable, high-tempo operations for extended periods. It suggested that the Americans intended to push harder and farther into the Pacific, applying constant pressure until something broke. Some Japanese officers clung to hope that the Americans would suffer from logistical strain. Too many ships, too many aircraft, too many moving parts. But the opposite seemed to be happening. The bigger the American fleet became, the more efficiently it operated. Supply ships, oilers, repair vessels, and replenishment groups kept pace with the combat units. The Americans were learning to conduct underway replenishment with a proficiency that stunned Japanese observers. They could refuel, restock, and rearm their carriers without returning to port. It was as if the ocean itself had become their base. By late that year, the implications were painfully clear. The Japanese no longer held the initiative. The Americans were seizing it, keeping it, and expanding it. And every time a single Essex launched 90 aircraft in under an hour, that initiative grew. Even so, Japan was not prepared to surrender the Central Pacific. There remained one more card to play. The hope that a decisive battle, under carefully chosen conditions, could blunt American strength and buy Japan time to regroup. The Imperial Navy's high command believed that if they could strike a devastating blow, perhaps inflict the loss of several American carriers, they might yet negotiate from a position of partial strength. But increasingly, such hopes felt untethered from reality. The Americans' tempo was relentless. Intelligence reports warned that new Essex carriers were arriving faster than Japan could sink them. Task force organizations were swelling, and while Japanese pilots reported dwindling resources, the Americans appeared to have an inexhaustible supply of aircraft. Still, war is unpredictable. Even overwhelming strength must be tested in battle. And the Americans were approaching. The waters around the Marianas, once the farthest reaches of Japanese defensive lines, were now battlegrounds in waiting. Airfields on Saipan, Tinian, and Guam prepared for the storm they knew was coming. Japan's naval aviators were determined to fight, even if the odds had turned against them. Many of them, young, resolute, proud, did not fully appreciate the gulf that had opened between their capabilities and those of the enemy. They had grown up with stories of the Kido Butai's triumphs at the start of the war. In their minds, Japan's naval aviation still possessed the spirit, if not the strength, to inflict a decisive blow. But spirit was not steel. Spirit was not speed. Spirit was not the ability to launch 90 aircraft in under an hour from a single floating airbase that the Americans called the Essex. And soon, those young aviators would see for themselves what that meant. The sea around the Marianas was deceptively calm in the weeks before the great fleets converged there. Beneath that surface, beneath the rhythm of waves that had not changed in thousands of years, something enormous was gathering. It was not just steel, it was momentum. It was doctrine and industry and desperation and hope, two nations accelerating toward a collision that would decide the future of the Pacific. For months, Japanese intelligence officers had watched American movements with growing unease. The United States was not merely conducting raids anymore. It was pushing closer, step by step, toward territory that Tokyo considered sacred ground. The Marianas were not just islands, they were stepping stones to the home islands themselves. If the Americans seized them, Japan's inner ring would be exposed. American B-29 bombers could reach Tokyo. Supply lines from the south would be strained to their breaking point. The war, in effect, would be fighting on Japan's doorstep. Yet, the Imperial Navy still believed it had a chance, if it acted decisively. Plans emerged under the code name AGO, a sweeping strategy intended to halt the American advance with a single massive carrier battle. It was a plan infused with both hope and denial. Hope, because it relied on the idea that Japan's remaining carriers, though diminished, still possessed the ability to launch a coordinated strike. Denial, because the planners had convinced themselves that American power had limits that did not, in fact, exist. One of the core assumptions baked into the AGO plan was that American carriers operated in predictable cycles. Japanese planners believed that the enemy could not maintain battle tempo indefinitely. They assumed that the Americans, despite their industrial might, would still be constrained by the physics of deck operations. No carrier, they thought, could launch and recover planes non-stop without exhausting crews or overwhelming the deck. But the Essex-class carriers were designed to do exactly this. In the lead-up to the battle, American task forces drilled continuously. Pilots practiced rapid turnaround procedures. Deck crews rehearsed coordinated movements so frequently that their actions became muscle memory. Flight deck officers developed new hand signals to speed up communication. Ordnance teams studied ways to streamline the rearming process. And critically, the air groups themselves were expanding, receiving fresh pilots and brand new aircraft straight from American factories. Japanese reconnaissance pilots who shadowed the American fleet again reported visions that confused their superiors. They described flight operations that never seemed to pause, a constant cycle, aircraft rising and returning, the deck alive, with motion no matter the hour. One pilot wrote that the American carriers appeared to breathe, a living system inhaling and exhaling waves of planes. The metaphor was not far from the truth. The Essex was not static, it was dynamic, An ecosystem of machines and men working in rhythm, it was the culmination of everything the Americans had learned from earlier battles, a synthesis of design, doctrine, and raw industrial mass. And now, as the Americans moved toward the Marianas, that system was about to be tested on a scale no navy had ever attempted. In Tokyo, the shadowing reports continued to sow unease. Some officers dismissed them outright. Others insisted on revisions to the Eigo plan. Admiral Ozawa himself, though committed to the plan, understood that no strategy survived long once the first aircraft left their decks. The war would not wait for perfect conditions. As the fleets closed in, the Japanese prepared their own airfields on Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. These forward bases would act as force multipliers, enabling land-based aircraft to join carrier strikes. It was a sound idea in theory, but the Americans had their own air power, more than enough to contest those islands and suppress their runways. And when American battleships and cruisers opened up with their long-range guns, the Japanese airfields shuddered under the bombardment. By the time the Imperial Navy's carriers approached the area, many of their planned land-based supports were badly degraded. Yet, the plan pressed forward. On board the Japanese carriers, pilots prepared for the coming battle with a mixture of determination and quiet dread. Many were young, far younger than the men who had flown at Pearl Harbor and in the early months of the war. They lacked the training hours their predecessors had enjoyed. They flew into combat lacking the confidence that steady experience brings. And they knew, from whispers and rumors, that the Americans were coming in greater numbers than Japan had ever faced before. But they also knew this was their moment. This was the decisive battle. If they succeeded, they might stop the American advance. If they failed, well, most of them did not allow their minds to go that far. Far to the east, aboard the Essex and her sister carriers, the atmosphere was different. The American pilots were not reckless. They were intensely focused, but they carried a confidence born from training, equipment, and numbers. They knew that their carriers could launch enormous strike waves. They knew that they had radar support that would likely detect any Japanese approach. They knew that their aircraft, the Hellcats, Avengers, and Dauntlesses, were state-of-the-art, maintained by skilled crews, flown by well-prepared aviators. And perhaps most importantly, they knew they were not alone. The Essex was only one of many. On a humid morning as dawn approached, radar screens aboard the American task force flickered with distant signals. Something was coming. The Japanese had launched their opening strikes. Within minutes, flight deck crews raced into action. Pilots buckled into cockpits. Engines roared to life. The Essex's launch crews prepared to do what they had practiced endlessly, send aircraft into the sky as quickly as humanly possible. And they did. Aircraft shot off the deck one after another. The launches so rapid that observers described it as a flood of steel. American fighters rose to form protective screens. Dive bombers and torpedo aircraft followed, ready to hunt down Japanese carriers once the enemy was located. The speed of the American response stunned even some of the U.S. officers. The Essex and her sister carriers were not just performing well, they were operating at a tempo that would have been unthinkable only a few years earlier. More than 80 aircraft were airborne before the Japanese strike wave had even closed half the distance. Another dozen followed in short order. One American officer remarked that it felt as if they had split the sky open. The Japanese pilots flying toward the American fleet had expected resistance. They had not expected to meet such overwhelming force so quickly. The radar-directed American Combat Air Patrol descended on them with ruthless efficiency. Hellcats tore through Japanese formations, breaking them apart long before they reached the carriers. In that moment, the disparity between the two forces became painfully clear. Japanese pilots fought bravely, but they were outnumbered, outgunned, and lacking the tactical radar support that allowed the Americans to coordinate their defenses with near-perfect timing. When the surviving Japanese aircraft finally caught sight of the American carriers, they faced a wall of anti-aircraft fire, so dense it seemed almost physical. The Essex and the other carriers maneuvered skillfully, dodging torpedoes and bombs. Despite Japan's best efforts, the strike inflicted minimal damage. Meanwhile, American aircraft continued to launch. The Essex's Flight deck crews barely had time to wipe sweat from their brows before the next wave lined up. More fighters, more bombers, more everything. The Japanese had assumed that the Americans could not sustain such tempo. But the Essex proved them wrong again and again. The Americans were operating in continuous cycles, sending out wave after wave, retrieving returning aircraft, refueling them, rearming them, sending them back out. It was the rhythm of an industrial power that had mastered the art of carrier warfare. At the height of the battle, American intelligence officers intercepted fragmented Japanese transmissions, distress calls, requests for reinforcements, frantic attempts to coordinate, reports of aircraft losses that were difficult even for American analysts to believe. On the Japanese side, Admiral Ozawa struggled to maintain coherence. His pilots were disappearing. Land-based reinforcements from the Marianas were being shot down before they could join the fight. The Americans, those relentless Essex carriers, seemed to have aircraft everywhere at once. By nightfall, Japanese commanders realized the grim truth. Their strike capability was collapsing. Too many pilots were lost. Too many aircraft were down. The carriers could not launch another coordinated attack. And the Americans, still flush with aircraft, were preparing for their next wave. This was the moment Japan had never imagined at the start of the war, the moment when the Imperial Navy, once the most advanced naval aviation force in the world, found itself hopelessly outmatched, not by cunning, but by scale. A single Essex-class carrier could launch nearly 100 aircraft in under an hour. But now there were multiple Essexes in the same task force. Together, they were generating sortie numbers that dwarfed anything the Japanese had ever prepared for. And those waves kept coming hour after hour, each one pulling the Japanese fleet closer to irreversible defeat. The battle was not over. Not yet. But in the minds of many Japanese officers watching the sky fill with American aircraft, the outcome was already clear. The future belonged to the carriers that could launch faster, recover faster, strike harder, and do it again and again without rest. And the Essex led them. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.